Ohio gozaimasu. Japan. The nation famous for its bullet trains, electrical devices, comics, anime, vending machines, regular earthquakes, lovely geishas, and the enormous Mount Fuji. Despite suffering significant Allied destruction during World War II, the nation went on to develop one of the largest economies in the world. The same allies who devastated Japan also allowed them unrestricted access to their markets to aid in its reconstruction. Between 1955 and 1973, Japan experienced an average yearly growth rate of 9%, which was an economic miracle, especially for a nation recovering from civil war. From 1973 to 1990, it added another 4% to its average annual growth, and these 3 decades of economic prosperity turned Japan into a financial superpower. This time period could be referred to as Japan's Golden Age. The nation dominated a number of industries, including those involving cars, semiconductors, entertainment, and consumer electronics, including everything from cameras to video games and Walkmans to pocket radios. Companies in Japan were doing well, paying employees on a piece rate basis, and most importantly, people's living standards and savings levels were rising. Japan's GDP at the time reached about 75% of the US's, which was astounding for a nation with half the US's population and a smaller area than the state of California. Japan's development rate was so astounding that it inspired pessimistic forecasts that it will eventually surpass the US economy to overtake it as the largest economy in the world. But it didn't take place. Instead, the nation experienced an economic catastrophe that halted the expansion. However, what went wrong? Early in the 1980s, the US dollar was significantly stronger than the Japanese yen, making US exports more expensive and imports less expensive. That negatively impacted the US trade imbalance. US businesses who have struggled to market their products overseas have voiced their complaints. What was the connection to Japan? Well, the US took action to make this work in their favor. The G5 nations, the United States, Japan, United Kingdom, Germany, and France, met at the Plaza Hotel in New York. The meeting's goal was to weaken the US dollar's value relative to the Japanese yen and the West German mark. We don't want to get into the specifics of why Japan initially agreed to it. It was a turning point, though. The abrupt increase in the value of the yen had a significant yet unexpected and unintended impact. It had a negative effect on Japan's export sector because a sizable portion of its overall exports went to US consumers. Businesses in the US were pleased, but not so much in Japan. How did the nation respond to it? There are 2 methods. Fiscal and monetary policies. The central bank implements monetary policy, which entails adjusting interest rates, whereas fiscal policy is concerned with taxation and expenditure by the government. The Japanese central bank recognized the potential impact on Japanese companies' competitiveness of a 50% decline in the value of the dollar relative to the yen in a matter of months. The depreciation of the dollar had an impact on more than just the export industry because it made imports less expensive and caused inflation to fall towards deflation. In the previous video, we saw how high inflation rates are bad and how central banks typically aim for a low level of inflation, typically around 2%, to maintain economic growth. On the other hand, deflation is a nightmare, and central banks go to great lengths to prevent it. They used monetary policy to address the problem by reducing interest rates, which is a perfectly acceptable and customary course of action in this context. The plan was to improve domestic demand and consumer spending in order to raise inflation rates to healthy levels. What occurs if interest rates are reduced? Simple. Because it's simpler to repay, more individuals want to take out loans for things like automobiles, homes, businesses, etc. The economy is boosted by this exchange of money and consumer spending. Japanese banks started to lend money to businesses and individuals more readily after being pushed by the government, allowing borrowers to spend and reinvest the money in the economy to stimulate it. Japan's citizens are known as savers, and the nation was already a significant creditor. They borrowed this money and mostly invested it in the real estate and stock markets. Real estate and stock prices skyrocketed as a result of people using their newly purchased properties as security for increasingly larger loans as borrowing became simpler. Large firms, particularly those that the Plaza Accord deal had a negative influence on, also became involved in taking out large loans and investing them in stocks and the real estate market. The more profits they received, the more they borrowed, and the more the prices increased. This cycle kept going, and eventually a bubble started to form. The economy appeared to be growing, at least on the surface. At this moment, the economy appeared to be a sweet geisha, but it was actually developing into a huge bubble the size of a sumo wrestler. The debt continued to grow. Younger people could no longer afford the prices, and the company's competitiveness and export business were constantly declining. The central bank attempted to act as a check on the bubble by revising monetary policy, but by the time the Tokyo Stock Exchange plummeted by 60%, things had already spiraled out of control. Companies' profits decreased as a result of them making more money from the stock market and the real estate market than they did from selling their products. The economy remained stagnant over the following decade, from 1991 to 2001, commonly known as the lost decade, which ended up being several decades due to the persistence of the stagnation and the economy's glacial pace for 3 decades. It continues to have an impact today, making it one of the most popular topics in economics. With an average life expectancy of 85, Japan leads the world. With almost 34 million people, or about 27% of the entire population, over the age of 65, it has the oldest population in the world. Because older individuals buy fewer new automobiles, homes, and consumer goods than younger people do, the aging population reduces the demand factor in the economy. Additionally, compared to the taxes paid by the working population, they take more in retirement benefits. A significant issue in the years to come will be the population decline. One of the lowest birth and fertility rates is seen in Japan. More immigration could help with this, but the Japanese are fairly homogeneous and conformist. People find it challenging to defy cultural standards. This makes the country undesirable to talented immigrants and makes it challenging to advance. Add to that the language barrier and unwelcoming immigration rules. Disaster-prone land is not appealing to foreign investors as a real estate investment. A foolish argument has been made that the labor shortfall and low birth rates will be solved by robots. Although automation would likely close certain gaps, welcoming immigrants seems like a sensible course of action. But in essence, the Japanese would rather work with a cold, heartless machine than a real person from another nation. You should look at folks who have wet anime characters if it seems unrealistic. Cities are more impacted by depopulation than are rural places. Compared to their population, rural areas get more government aid. In other places, it's difficult to justify building roads, since hospitals are essentially empty and trains rarely have passengers. Additionally, they would favor living in cities even if they welcomed immigration. Additionally, people from rural areas search for employment in large cities. Due to the younger generation's lack of interest in agriculture and the predominance of older workers, the industry is in decline. Buddhist temples and their priests are slowly disappearing. Due to a shortage of attendees, several local festivals and events are already waning. It will become increasingly difficult for the rail sector to make any money in the countryside. Keiretsu is a cooperative arrangement between a few businesses that grants them monopoly-like exclusive control over the supply. The free market is so rendered less free. Government support for this may make it seem as though the government has created an atmosphere that is advantageous for businesses, but it is ultimately bad for the economy. Additionally, it drives away entrepreneurs and inventors who are unable to compete with low-cost models like Keiretsu. Additionally, it deters and demoralizes non-Japanese businesses from investing since they perceive a clear competitive disadvantage with the Keiretsu. Long-term employment may sound appealing, but it also has drawbacks. Employers hire college grads who typically work for them for the rest of their lives. Millions of workers take use of this system for its benefits without updating their skill set and continue working until retirement, which is counterproductive in an era of rapid technological advancement where skills quickly become out of date. Although businesses in Japan have significantly scaled back this strategy, its effects nevertheless persist. When it comes to the industries it was previously a market leader in, it appears that Japan has failed to step up its game. Its Asian rivals in China, Taiwan, and Korea began to challenge it in terms of pricing, warranties, and a wider selection of items. Another element contributing to the economic downturn is the yen carry trade. Due to the low interest rates, investors borrow money at a reduced cost in yen and invest it in high-yielding assets like the US dollar. As a result, there is a greater demand for yen than the government would want. As a result, exports decline and the economy no longer experiences the essential minimum inflation. In the past 10 years, Japan has repeatedly overtaken other countries as the top holder of US debt. The nation does this to keep the value of the yen low in relation to the dollar so that it can increase exports. Energy usage in Japan is mainly reliant on imported petrol and crude oil. Except for coal, there are no domestic fossil fuel resources in the nation. Japan would need to find alternative energy sources in a world without oil to suit its needs. It had already begun to move towards nuclear energy, but the Fukushima nuclear plant accident alarmed those in the general population who are against it. We have discussed the monetary policy that central banks carry out. Fiscal policy is the next. which is just a fancy way of saying taxes and government spending. By decreasing taxes and increasing spending, a government can stimulate the economy. As a result, people and businesses would have more money to invest in companies and hire more workers. Consumer spending may benefit from this, which could eventually lead to economic development. However, if you use all of this money on initiatives and benefits that don't provide adequate results, you'll only end up farther in debt. And Japan has incurred debt unlike any other country. A country's debt to GDP ratio should be as low as possible. A prolonged length of time with a debt to GDP ratio of 75% could be detrimental to economic growth. Forget about the $27 trillion US debt. Although it appears to be enormous, the GDP of the entire nation is almost equal to it. They can therefore manufacture an amount equivalent to their debt. On the other hand, Japan has the largest debt in the world, over 250% of its GDP, making it the most indebted nation on earth with no sign of relief. As a result, it is known as the country of growing debt. Japan will endure for a very long time. More borrowing won't restore freedom, it will just boost the economy. Some people are hopeful that Japan has recovered and entered the post-bubble era because the stock market appears to be at healthy levels and unemployment is low, among other things. But unless they take some drastic action, the stagnation continues and there is no remarkable increase showing that the economy could trend towards growth. What reforms should be implemented to end the stagnation and position Japan's economy for long-term growth? We'll do our best to respond to every inquiry and feedback. I appreciate you viewing.